All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, From Midwest to the Nation, How New BESS Legislation Can Accelerate U.S. Clean Energy Development, hosted by Strategic Economic Research and Aileron. If we haven't met yet, my name is Ethan Loomis. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Sales here at SER. And if you have any questions about today's webinar or you want to learn more about SER, please feel free to reach out to me. A couple housekeeping items. This session will be recorded and shared with everyone who registered. When the recording is ready, we'll get that sent out within a week here. And we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A feature through Zoom. We will do our best to answer all of them, and we'll be answering those at the end of the session after all of the presentations are done. Without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to the Aileron team. Please take it away.
All right. Thanks, Ethan. My name is Peter Gray, President Aileron Communications, and I'll be the first one talking today. I have been in the renewable energy, clean energy space doing communications and community engagement for over a decade, close to two. And if we can pull up that slide, I'll give a quick intro on Aileron and what we are. We're working in over a dozen states doing media, policy work, local ordinances, community engagement to help get projects permitted. Our team has been successful in getting a couple gigawatts of wind and solar and storage permitted in the last couple of years. And we did get to play a role in a couple of the state policies that we're going to talk about today. And then on the next slide.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Newport. I'm the Director of Community Relations for Aileron. I am actually located in Michigan, in Metro Detroit. I am focused on education and engagement for energy storage projects here in Michigan and around the Midwest. I spent the better half of my career in communications and community relations for the Economic Development Group here in Michigan, and then in the automotive industry. So happy to be here with you.
Thanks. And so here's a little bit about Aileron. As I mentioned, we're firm that's been around a while doing community engagement. We do have a pretty long track record in battery energy storage support. So about 10 years experience doing BESS projects. That crosses from community engagement to media relations, branding, and marketing, working on local ordinances and permitting, and then, as I mentioned, state policy. So battery storage is growing a lot. There's a lot of growing concern and opposition around it as well. So we're kind of focusing one of our practice areas on that. We have a new site going up called energystoragepartners.com, which is sort of our practice area dedicated to battery energy storage. And then we're going to talk about policies in certain Midwest states that have passed laws recently, as well as kind of broad overarching concepts about community engagement. But if there's other states that folks are curious about, I think between us and the SER team, we've got a pretty good national perspective. So feel free to, when we get to Q&A, chime in on anything else as well. So I'll give, I think, back to Heather to kick this part off.
Yeah, so before we go into some of the state policies, just kind of laying the framework of what we're seeing in energy storage in terms of opposition and how we approach engagement given some of this opposition. So 40 gigawatts deployed in the US, only six safety incidents last year, including Moss Landing. But as you're seeing on the screen, and as I'm sure everyone knows, incidents and opposition attracts really significant media attention. And primarily those fears stem from fires, environmental concerns, and visual and noise. Misinformation is driving that. Some commentary and some articles have pointed to local opposition as one of the major barriers holding back the energy storage projects. So if we go to the next slide, our approach to community engagement, some of our guiding principles is really understanding your community before you do public engagement. And that means understanding the local context, the history, the values, really importantly, past experiences with development overall and existing concerns. So listening early can prevent missteps later. Using local relationships to build trust and support. That can move projects more smoothly and efficiently when trusted local voices are engaged early. That can mean either officials, people that residents trust, but also, having a partner that can be boots on the ground, that understands the community, that can be there, be in person, and be a face to the project. Relationships with those local leaders and community connectors, they create credibility that no outside messaging can replace. Don't avoid concerns, address them directly. So silence or deflection really leaves room for misinformation to fill the gap. If when you address concerns directly, especially around safety, this builds confidence and really shows that you respect the community and its questions and concerns. So meeting with opponents, we view opponents as stakeholders too. It doesn't mean conceding. It doesn't mean that some of their concerns and misinformation are going to be used in the project. It just means we're listening to them. We're understanding motivations and lowering the temperature, which is really important. And oftentimes, we're not expecting them to be a supporter at the end of it, but we can find some middle ground and educate at certain times. And then keeping receipts, and that's not a bookkeeping thing. It's just keeping a record of commitments, of presentations and data you've shared, and follow-up actions. That reinforces credibility. And so when questions resurface, whether it's a resident or an official, and they will, you can point back to the facts with transparency and consistency. So if we go to the next slide, I will cover Michigan's PA 230. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Pete.
We'll get to it. Yep. No problem. Yeah, and so we can talk about community engagement for weeks at a time because it's really near and dear to what we do. But so we're going to touch just on some top level stuff, but I did want to get into a little bit about how engagement on battery energy storage is different from wind and solar. Our background before getting into BESS was, started off in wind and solar. I think a lot of the industry took the same path. So there's pretty established practices for community engagement on wind and solar, and then a growing sort of different tactic for BESS. Couple of items here, wind and solar, we look at the impacts to farmland. That's a key point that opposition makes. Not so much for BESS. The key concern with batteries is going to be around fire and contamination. Visual impacts, again, more of an issue for wind, not so much for BESS. And wildlife concerns, when you have a smaller footprint, that's not usually the tactic that a lot of opponents will take. So, and the woke blue electrons bullet I put there is a little tongue-in-cheek, although folks have used that term. But there's a political affiliation or a cultural affiliation with wind and solar. Unfortunately, electricity is electricity, but that's the way things have been put. So it's a different story currently for BESS. It hasn't gotten the same sort of political connotation. But what we do see in opposition to battery storage is folks thinking of this as a new or untested technology, even though, as Heather mentioned, we've got 40 gigawatts operating now. But that unknown, and also for developers who've not been in the game for battery storage as long, they may not have a large operating portfolio where they can point to and say, this is the project that we've done and it worked. So that's a weakness for folks when they enter communities who want to point to them and say, we don't want to be your guinea pig. There's a lot of unknowns that folks can point to and say, this is going to be, soil contamination, water contamination, a lot of things that don't have a basis in fact, but cause a lot of emotions, a lot of fear, and drive opposition to projects. The other point that's sort of bubbling up now is opposition to data centers, kind of slides over into opposition to battery storage. Sometimes those projects are actually connected. Sometimes it's just sort of connected in people's minds, but different constituencies, different groups that kind of play against each other or with each other to oppose projects. So that's the landscape we're looking at for BESS. And then when we do our messaging and our proactive work on that, and that's kind of in the next slide, we've got sort of different messages that work. Wind and solar, you've got typically a large number of landowners talking about their own personal property rights, and they can be great advocates for a project. In BESS, generally one landowner doing quite well financially from the project. Often they don't want to be the face of advocacy for that project. So you got to find a different coalition to back you up. Local jobs are a good message often for wind and solar to some extent. Not so much for BESS. It just doesn't have the same number of people that it needed to operate it. But we do see a large investment in a small footprint for BESS. So the tax implications for something that might be 10 to 20 acres are pretty significant for a community, and that can be a big selling point. Um, Wind and solar, we're generating homegrown clean energy. BESS, we're not generating, but we can talk about increasing reliability, reducing blackouts, and keeping the lights on. That's a very important message as far as attracting new business to an area, increasing the value of folks who are living there, making sure that their quality of life is good because they have a reliable source of power, and that can be compelling for a local community. Wind and solar, we talk about keeping the family farms sustained with a new source of revenue. Not always the same take for battery storage, but we can talk about bringing electrons onto the grid, making the power system more efficient regardless of generation. So we generally get away from, even though clean energy is our goal here at Aileron, we can talk about storage regardless of wind solar. We're just making the grid work better. And so that depoliticizes or kind of takes some of the heat off of what we see from wind and solar. And we're going to get into some specifics and some state policies that obviously our engagement all happens in the context of processes and legislation that's at the state and local level. So Heather will take it away because Heather has successfully permitted a whole lot of battery storage in Michigan, and she can walk us through a state law there.
Great. So if we can go to the next slide, Michigan PA 233 is a public act that creates an alternative siting path. So eligible projects, solar, wind, and BESS that are listed on the slide can seek approval through the Michigan Public Service Commission, or MPSC, instead of local zoning. This was designed to address inconsistent local zonings, moratoriums, and denials that made it really difficult to site energy projects. And then those projects are really needed for grid reliability and the state energy goals. So it aims to balance local control with statewide needs, offering a consistent, transparent approval framework. What it doesn't do is ban renewable or BESS projects. It doesn't eliminate public input. It does not require communities to approve every project, and it doesn't allow blanket moratoriums. Local control can be protected if a zoning rule is workable and follows state guidelines. So they can adopt compatible renewable energy ordinance, or CREO, and that must not be more restrictive than state guidelines. I haven't listed the state guidelines for BESS, but I have them if anyone's interested. But important thing to know is I've seen some communities not follow the guidelines word for word, but create something that's both workable for their community and the developer. And so I've seen some communities work directly with developers on language and process, and that really creates a process that works for both. If we go to the next slide, I can kind of cover what the process is. So it's local first. So if a community has a compatible renewable energy ordinance, the developer must apply locally. If no CREO exists or the community denies the project, then the developer can go to the MPSC process. So the key steps that need to happen 30 days before any application is filed, and there's about 5 projects, not BESS specifically, but solar as well, that are going through this process currently that are public. You notify the local government. So that is an official letter, email to the supervisor, mayor, local official, asking if they have a CREO and asking if they're willing to meet. The next is hosting a public meeting, and that's almost like an open house. Residents are invited. It has to be within the community boundaries, and oftentimes the MPSC staff will attend. And that's sharing basic project details, not necessarily site plans, but what this project is all about. So if the project advances to the Michigan Public Service Commission, They review technical, safety, environmental, public interest factors. So the safety protections must comply with national standards, NFPA 855. It requires, and this one's an important one, an alternative location analysis. So that means if you have a specific site in mind, you also have to look at alternative sites, why they didn't work, but also a viable alternative location. That's a really important one. The process considers local input, comments, and public meetings, and the developer can pay up to $75,000 for intervener compensation funds. So that means if they want to hire legal counsel to oppose the project. The whole process is significantly a little more in depth and can be longer than local permitting. It can take up to 1 year. However, the process is based on decisions and not facts or opinions and fear, which sometimes we are seeing with local zoning. And now I think Pete will cover Indiana and Illinois.
Yep. I'll spend a little bit of time on Indiana before getting into more detail on Illinois, but some folks may be familiar with House Act 1173 from Indiana, which was passed in 2023. It's not that new, and it doesn't do a whole lot, but it does, of course, add another level of approvals for the state of Indiana. The key thing about this law is that your battery storage systems in Indiana must comply with NFPA 855, the National Fire Protection Code, which is best practice for most developers and operators anyway. So it's a reasonable requirement. Also, the systems have to be above the 100-year floodplain, and you have to offer training to first responders. So this is all well and good. The initial drafts of this bill were a lot more problematic. The sponsor thought this is going to give us a sort of across the board statewide baseline for permitting battery storage, but it doesn't supersede county authority in any way. It doesn't take any authority away from counties. So while the intention may have been to say this is how safety is managed in Indiana, counties can basically set whatever rules they want. So it's pretty straightforward at the state level, and it does give developers a chance to say Indiana has a strong safety law in place, so that's covered. You don't have to worry about it. That may or may not work. But one thing I like to point out about this legislation is it was sponsored and written by a member of the Indiana House who was had a battery project in his district. And his constituents were calling and saying that developer didn't answer a lot of questions, was kind of dismissive of their concerns. And so here we are now with a new piece of legislation. So the quote over there is from the bill sponsor and said, if the developer had sat down with a dozen families, we wouldn't be here. So I like to think that is a good talking point in favor of community engagement early and often. So with that, we'll get into Illinois. And Illinois' CRGA, the Clean and Reliable Grid Act. This was signed last week, becomes effective July 1st. I know a lot of folks, big team effort, big coalition work on this, and it was a successful bill. So Aileron was able to play a small part in that too, and hats off to my colleagues and everybody else that got it done. So here's what's going to happen. The bill's effective July 1st, and it does create a procurement. So there's a market through the state process. First one is going to be August 26th of this year, about a gigawatt split between PJM and MISO, or between the Ameren and ComEd territories in Illinois. And the financial mechanism will be an indexed storage credit. So basically that is flexible, but gets a bankable, financeable credit for folks who build and operate storage in Illinois. For that first procurement, projects have to be COD by the end of 2029. And the Illinois Power Agency, IPA, is going to hold workshops for this spring for bidders and get into all the details of the process, which are not necessarily fully baked yet, but they're going to be there. Additional procurements in 27 and 28 to get the state up to 3 gigawatts of storage by 2030. There's also integrated resource planning as part of this bill. So if that integrated resource planning says we need additional procurements, there will be maybe more storage added. And projects have to enter into a project labor agreement to participate in this program. So that means working with union labor. So we would recommend starting that engagement with labor early and making them friends, not adversaries. And there's a lot of stuff in this bill. We're going to talk about the stationary storage, utility scale storage pieces of it primarily here. So we can hit the next slide. So in addition to the procurement, we now have siting standards statewide in Illinois for BESS. We had wind and solar siting standards statewide a couple years ago from that legislation, and now we have similar for battery storage. They're listed here. I won't read them all to you, but they are pretty favorable for development, and they should be very workable for developers and operators. So counties must approve you if you comply with the state law. And it does also include guidelines for road use agreements, which was kind of a loophole in the previous law. And so that we would hope everyone holds hands and works together and everything's great, but there are, of course, issues with this. So on the next slide, we have a appeal process that's been created through this bill. So we saw this with wind and solar. Some counties said, well, this is the state law, we will comply. Others said, no, we're going to deny projects just for fun, or maybe for good reason. But there wasn't a good process for when folks didn't comply with the law or there was friction between the developer and the county. So now there's, through the Illinois Commerce Commission, an appeal process set up. This hasn't seen any test cases yet because the bill is not effective until July, but we will see. But this is the process for it, which is pretty straightforward. Gives the Illinois Commerce Commission a lot of authority to overrule if a county is not following the state law and to issue siting certificate for projects. So that's positive. I think the message here is this is a good law for development. We want to make sure it stays effective in its implementation. And I think part of that is going to be folks still doing right by the communities, still engaging, and not creating a backlash that's going to lead to revisions or repeal of this law, but actually make it successful so that it can be duplicated across the country. So that's my pitch for community engagement there. And I think that wraps up our portion of this webinar. We're going to hand it over to the folks at SER.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're like me on the Midwest or East Coast. So I'm going to start with a little bit about SER and what we do. So we provide economic consulting for renewable energy projects across the U.S. And so far, we have produced over 400 economic impact reports for renewable energy projects across 32 states. So our purpose at SER is to streamline the process of producing economic impact reports to make it as efficient as possible for developers and providing a comprehensive and highly accurate analysis to help developers with permitting and siting. And we also provide expert testimony in order to communicate the economic concepts to the public and decision makers. A little bit about myself and what I do at SER. I am the Director of Tax Research. So pretty much what I do is in my role title, I lead tax research for utility scale renewable energy projects across all 50 states. And I've been with SER for about a year now. Before SER, I have had multiple roles throughout property taxes and indirect taxes for renewable energy and other industries, and over 9 years experience overall in finance and accounting. And I have received my Master's of Tax degree from the University of Cincinnati in 2021. Okay, and so building off of what Heather and Peter walked through on the policy and permitting side, I'm going to focus on one lever that can quietly make or break BESS timelines, and that's property tax certainty. So when BESS property tax treatment is predictable, then projects move faster, not because developers love taxes, of course, but because predictability is what lenders, investors, and local stakeholders and communities need to get comfortable early. So the problem with BESS is BESS can actually get valued like long-lived infrastructure, as if it's going to just sit unchanged for decades, even though storage does have fast technology cycles and real obsolescence. That mismatch is where you get the tax surprise. And once a tax surprise hits, it's not just a spreadsheet issue anymore. It can trigger reassessments, appeals, debates over what's actually taxable, and late stage community friction because then the revenue story suddenly changes. So, a fix that we've been seeing that works is actually shifting away from just purely discretionary local treatment and towards actual clear state level rules, especially classification guidance and valuation and depreciation schedules. So, what we found is that creates a safe zone for modeling, so developers can use that, communities can understand it properly, and the project doesn't stall out in uncertainty. And this is where we found that the Midwest becomes the blueprint, because when states make property tax outcomes predictable, particularly around classification and depreciation, you get clearer permitting pathways, fewer disputes, and faster, more repeatable deployment. Next slide, please. Okay, so now the actual mechanics. So a BESS project isn't just one taxable thing. It's a bundle of assets, and most of the confusion comes from how the bundle gets split between real and personal property, because that split, of course, drives what's taxable, how it's valued, and how it depreciates. So on the left, you'll see what's often treated as real property. The site, the structural side, more permanent fixtures. This is the stuff that's fixed, physically tied to the land. So assessors typically default to real property treatment. And then on the right is often what's treated as personal property, anything that you think of as general equipment. And the practical point here is simple. If the split isn't clear, you get, is it real or is it personal disputes? You also get inconsistent county treatment and a lot more time spent in reassessment and appeals, which of course we do not want. So one way that we have found states reducing this uncertainty is by using published depreciation and valuation tables for the equipment side. One example is Michigan's interim use of what's called Table E by assessors, which is the Michigan State Tax Commission's depreciation table. And that's a good example of that approach being used currently in the Midwest. Next slide, please. Okay, so now two Midwest examples where statutes had actually codified BESS treatment and reduced assessor by assessor variability. So you see Indiana on the left side, SEA 1, which has become effective recently in 2025. It removes the 30% minimum value floor for depreciable business personal property that's placed in service after January 1st, 2025. So bottom line, values can decline faster over time, which changes the long-term revenue profile. And in practice, we are seeing more EDAs, economic development agreements, with fixed or per megawatt payments to keep a stable, auditable revenue story for the host communities. And then on the right, you'll see Ohio. So House Bill 15 actually sets a 7% assessment for new energy storage tangible personal property that's treated as production conversion equipment for property that's first taxable in tax year 2027 and later. That's a meaningful reset of the default baseline, but structure still matters in this case. So Ohio's pilot agreements, qualified energy projects, are actually project specific. And one important factor is that standalone BESS doesn't qualify on its own for this. So modeling often compares the reduced rate taxable tangible personal property path versus a QEP pilot or other possible negotiated structures. So the big takeaway pretty much is that clear statutory rules reduce reassessment risk and make outcomes easier to communicate early. So fortunately, we are starting to see more codified regulations regarding BESS assessment. Okay. So far we talked about statewide rules that make assessment more predictable. The next lever is more site-specific, location-based incentives that can materially change the property tax outcome if you're in the right place. So on the left here, you'll see Michigan, as Peter and Heather talked about in detail. So for Michigan, on the property tax side, renewable energy renaissance zones can actually abate a lot of state and local property taxes inside the designated zone. And that can include both real and personal property taxes, depending on the actual zone terms. And the important caveat here is its eligibility and designation dependent. So you don't get just by being a storage project. Unfortunately, you get it by being in the right zone under the right zone rules. And then on the right, you'll see Michigan compared with Illinois. So for Illinois, this is more of a local toolkit model. Enterprise zones and high impact business designations can support local property tax abatements on the incremental value of any new improvements, but it is subject to local participation. So the actual deal structure and willingness can vary by the community, the locality. And separately, Illinois actually also has expanded a renewable energy sales tax exemption to include energy storage under its Public Act 103-1066. So that's not property tax, but it is a big part of the overall cost picture that does affect siting and financing, of course, in the project. Next slide, please. Okay, and okay. So now we're going to shift from incentives to something that creates a lot of headaches, and that's the fixture treatment. So in some states, the tax outcome hinges less on the technology and more on how it's actually being installed. So on this comparison slide between these two Midwest states, you'll see Wisconsin on the left. So for Wisconsin, starting with the 2024 assessment, most personal property is broadly exempt under Wisconsin's Act 12, but fixtures and utility assessed property do remain taxable. So classification still matters for BESS. You can still end up with a taxable value depending on how the system is treated. For BESS, the practical question will often be, is it treated as equipment or as a fixture or a utility property? Then on the other side for Kansas, so for Kansas, one interesting exemption, solar may qualify for a 10-year exemption, but standalone BESS is not automatic. That does not get that automatic exemption. So a key path then for BESS would be the commercial and industrial machinery and equipment, CIME exemption. And that typically works best when the BESS is treated as tangible personal property, because once it's treated as a fixture, the exemption may not apply the same way. And this matters because when fixture treatment is ambiguous, tax exemptions are harder to defend and local negotiations can slow down, can slow. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we covered how some Midwest states are creating more predictable rules and where uncertainty still shows up, I want to close with what actually keeps projects moving, which is a clear revenue story. By the way, sorry if you hear my dog in the background. Apparently, she has a big opinion regarding best practices. So on the left, evaluation discipline. So starting with cost basis, transparency. So we found that during our research for developers in these states, having a clean asset list, commissioning date, and documenting what's inside versus outside the fence, especially interconnection scope, is very crucial. The use of, as I mentioned earlier, published tables or depreciation schedules where they currently exist, and being disciplined about separating site work from equipment, and again, documenting ownership, because it can change what's taxable and how it's valued. On the right side, I mentioned trust deliverables. So giving stakeholders a revenue estimate range with assumptions, plus a sample of a tax bill or a pilot schedule. So the numbers feel real is helpful, even if it's just assumptions at that point. And that's something that SCR, we help developers with every day. Adding a plain language decommissioning summary and avoiding two common pitfalls, which is not treating site work as fully removable when it isn't, or valuing equipment like it's 30-year infrastructure while ignoring tech obsolescence. So pretty much the bottom line is predictable valuation plus clear community documentation can reduce disputes and help successful Midwest practices scale nationally. And hopefully we start to see more of that. And with this, I'm going to hand it off to Chris.
Hello, everyone. Good to be with you all. My name is Chris Thankin. I am the Director of Economic Impact Analysis here at SCR. I've worked on hundreds of projects, wind, solar, battery, transmission project, natural gas projects, nuclear, coming into data centers as of recent. I've done expert testimony in several states, speaking engagements in others, so been all over the country talking about all this stuff. And today, for my portion of the presentation, I'm going to be discussing our analysis and how it applies to specific New York State battery projects. So on the next slide, I'll go over just a quick primer about economic impacts. So when we do an economic impact analysis, we are trying to quantify the different ripple effects that happen throughout a given location due to new investment, new spending as a result of energy projects, and in this case, specifically battery projects. So the first ripple effect we look at are called the direct impacts, or as we call them casually, on-site personnel impacts. So think of the construction workers, boots on the ground, folks actually building the battery project. So concrete masons, electricians, crane operators, iron workers, things of the people of those nature are actually building the project. But then those people need inputs, materials, goods, and services spending to actually build the project. And that comes into our secondary ripple that we call indirect impacts or supply chain impacts. So spending on fasteners, concrete, rebar, or legal services, title services, all of these different inputs that are needed during construction and operations are categorized into the indirect level of impacts. And then finally, we have our induced level of impacts. We call these our community spending impacts. So all the workers categorized into the direct and indirect level, they'll earn their wages and salary from work related to the project, and then they will spend that within the local community at grocery stores, restaurants, bars, retail, entertainment, medical offices, hospitals, housing, things of that nature. And that related economic activity and job supporting is categorized at that induced level. So the entire economic impact of a particular project is a summation of the direct, indirect, and induced levels of impacts. And on the next slide, I'll talk about some of the factors that affect economic impacts. So the amount of money that's being spent within a project county and a project state can affect the levels of economic impact. So if you're intending to spend a lot in those areas, you can expect higher economic impacts. If you're not intending to spend a lot, it could reduce those. But that also is a factor of how big the relevant economy is, how robust it is, how applicable it is. Are there a lot of industries that you can rely on for the materials, goods, and services spending that you need? If so, if you're in a major metro, sure, you could probably expect higher economic impacts. If you're in a really rural area, economic impacts are generally lower. Similarly, the relevant labor pool of construction workers also has a big effect. Larger population areas tend to have larger pools of construction workers, whereas rural areas have lower levels of construction workers. So those are just some things to keep in mind when thinking about economic impacts for your potential project. Now, with that background established, we will talk a little bit more about New York State's battery RFP on the next slide. So within the last year, NYSERDA, or New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, announced an RFP for an overall solicitation of 6 gigawatts of battery storage by 2030 in the state of New York. About half of that should come from utility scale battery storage. The first round of the RFP has recently closed, and they got about 16 gigawatts worth of interest. Of course, not all of those gigawatts will be built or awarded, but it just shows the level of enthusiasm and engagement that the process has solicited from developers. Now, the part of the RFP is all these attachments you see below. Pretty standard stuff when you're looking at a project, summaries, location, safety, things of that nature. But the thing that's really unique about this particular RFP at this particular time is that highlighted attachment D bid form. And that is something that SCR is uniquely positioned to help developers with. Now, before we get into that, I have to mention a really, really important part about this is that you can't spell NYSERDA without SCR. So please keep that in mind for all your battery projects. If you want to, you can boo your computer screen. I can't hear you. But so let's go to the next slide and talk more about attachment D. So attachment D is this Excel spreadsheet that's part of the application where developers will state the short-term and long-term incremental benefits to the state of New York. So things like number of jobs, compensation, and materials, services, and goods spending during construction operations. The other aspect of it are these disadvantaged community applicability percentages. So these are percentages that developers can state that will say, we estimate about X percentage will be benefiting a disadvantaged community. And that's a designation that you can find through the State of New York's data website and their GIS data that we were able to go to. Now, when we're talking jobs, compensation, spending, that sounds an awful lot like economic impact analysis. So we had several clients come to us seeking consulting on how to fill out this spreadsheet. So we were able to work on tens of projects within the state of New York over the last several months. And it's really important that we do that and we get things right because there is an independent audit and verification of this spending that happens in the future years. So it's really important that you have correct estimations, that you get some other insights if you're not feeling too comfortable with this. So it's very important that you have that paper trail of receipts, invoices, W-2s, 1099s, things of that nature so you can verify them to an auditor in the future. And there's also this risk benefit of having these higher criteria or higher marks of benefits and disadvantaged community applicability. So the higher these benefits are, the higher the percent of spending in disadvantaged communities, the better your project seems. But later on in the future, you have to verify that. And even the most well-intentioned developer can come into an unfortunate future reality, which disrupts their previous estimations. So being conservative, reducing some of that risk, potentially under-promising some of those benefits can show that you're committed to helping the state of New York in these two measured ways, but also trying to reduce that risk as well. The other thing we were looking at is creating broad categories. So in the spreadsheet, you're able to title and categorize certain spendings as you see fit as a developer. So having broad categories will allow you to be able to categorize certain spending under a larger umbrella and therefore potentially being able to move spending around so that it makes more sense within that spreadsheet. So all of these different aspects of this RFP, of this particular attachment D, we had a lot of great conversations with a lot of developers on how exactly to manage that risk. When was it appropriate to go higher? When was it appropriate to go lower? And things of that nature. So very important way that economic impact analysis was able to benefit a specific state in a specific project set during a specific time. So thank you all for that. And I will turn it back over to Ethan.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And I'll have the rest of our panelists join for our Q&A portion of the webinar. Thank you to all attendees for your engagement thus far. I'm seeing some good questions already in the Q&A, so we will get started on that. But as you have other questions, please feel free to drop those in here. First question here says, does Aileron become involved in other than battery energy storage technologies? What about funding?
Short answer, yes. We've got experience working with venture capital and financial concerns as well as developers. So we'd probably be able to get engaged there depending on what the specifics are. And yeah, technology-wise, renewables are kind of the center of what we do, but we've worked on infrastructure and other technologies, natural resources and things like that too.
Great. This next question, I'll let Deb answer this. It has to do with property taxes. It says, please talk more. And this was early in the presentation that this question was asked, so maybe this was already answered through your presentation. But it says, please talk more about how BESS projects are assessed for property tax purposes. How much does the local county assessor need to know about CapEx, et cetera, and how does that influence assessed valuation?
Yeah, that is a great question. So most uh, counties would value BESS just like they would value any other big equipment heavy project, starting off with CapEx, because there usually aren't any comparable cells to reference. So from there, the assessor applies two big adjustments, really, kind of what I talked through in the presentation, what parts of the BESS project are taxable, which we simply call classification. So they would need a basic breakdown, so they would know what's equipment versus what's site, civil versus electrical, substation, things like that. As I mentioned, real versus personal property. So that, of course, affects what gets included and what rules would apply. And the second would be how fast it would decline in value, depreciation. So apply in a depreciation schedule or a percent good factor over time, and which is why I mentioned how important it is for states to have published valuation or depreciation schedules available. Um, the assessor doesn't really need your full financial model, I would say. They would typically need just a clean CapEx summary with things like total installed cost, COD and service year, major cost buckets, things like that. So, and that way, of course, if you provide that information early on to the assessor, the less the assessor has to guess, and guessing is where these tax surprises come about.
Great, thank you. Next question, I'll pass over to Heather to answer. It says, can you share the state guidelines for battery storage in Michigan?
Sure. So for setbacks, these are measured from the nearest edge of the perimeter fencing of the facility. So it's 300 feet from the nearest point on the outer wall of any occupied building or dwelling on a non-participating property. 50 feet from the edge of the nearest public road right of way, or 50 feet from the nearest shared property line of a non-participating property. Addition to setbacks, they must also comply with noise limits, and so that's not to exceed 55 dBA. That's measured at the wall of the nearest non-participating dwelling. Compliance with NFPA 855, dark sky friendly lighting solutions, and then the emergency response plan and hazard mitigation analysis. Those are all part of the MPSC, and I'm happy to share the link that includes wind and solar as well. So those are the requirements.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Next question I'll have Peter answer. It says, is just a clarification on Surge's effective date. Is it June 1, 2026 or July 1, 2026?
It is July 1, and I saw that one and I texted my colleague Carly who backed me up. So yeah, July 1 is the effective date. July 1 is 26.
Great. Thank you. Next question is there different treatment of small C&I, a commercial and industrial, or residential BESS in Surja versus utility scale?
Yes. Good question. So the stuff that I talked through with the IPA procurement and the multiple gigawatts is utility scale projects. And then there's another program that's set up in the law that becomes effective, I think, in 27 or 28. And that's a virtual power plant program. So distribution side owners of storage can participate in that and be compensated for the use of the storage that they own. I believe that's probably the most important impact for C&I and residential storage customers. But that's a good one if you want to email me, and there's probably more details to follow up, and maybe some folks that are better experts on it than myself.
Great. And Deb, I'll pass this one over to you. There's a few questions that are along the same vein, so I'll try and group them together here, but they just have to do with Illinois property tax practices. It says, can you clarify SER's treatment of real versus personal property taxes and how that relates to Illinois? There's another question in here as well that says, what percentage of BESS is generally for property tax, is valued as personal property? What percentage valued as real property? Explain how personal property is assessed in Illinois.
Yeah, yeah, so Illinois does not tax personal property. So in the slides you see here, the distinction between real and personal property is more so information regarding classification rather than taxation, specifically for Illinois. For our modeling, which whatever state it is, we still separate those asset types just for cross-state consistency. Site work, structural, civil improvements typically fall under real, while equipment like racks, containers, inverters are treated as personal in states that do tax it. So just showing consistent partitioning, it helps us benchmark projects across jurisdictions and explain what's included in the taxable base or EAB when we do our modeling. And so it's more about consistency and kind of showing states that do tax personal property, how those are seen across the Midwest, if that makes sense. And for your best question, I don't have the actual number percentages or anything like that off the top of my head, but feel free to if you want to reach out afterwards, you could talk to Ethan, and I'd be happy to answer any specific questions you have regarding specific percentages or tax regulations in Illinois.
Great. Thanks, Deb. Next question is for Chris here. It says, how do the analyses that SER prepares compare with REMI analysis reports?
Yeah, so at SER, we use the economic modeling service called IMPLAN. Stands for, it's like the abbreviated term for impact planning. We use that as a result of the national, or the formerly known National Renewable Energy Laboratory, used IMPLAN for their economic modeling spreadsheets and software. So that was just something we carried over into ours. I believe I haven't used REMI, but REMI is a competing economic modeling software. So both of these are good industry standard softwares to use. They can both provide quality insights. Of course, it really depends on the analyst who's inputting the numbers as opposed to just the calculator that's being used, which would be the software services. So both can be comparable. SCR uses IMPLAN instead of REMI, but I've seen other renewable related economic modeling reports utilizing REMI, and they are very good too.
Great. Thank you. Let's see. Next question here is, just want to confirm that the appeal process in Illinois through SERJA applies for all technologies, wind, solar, and BESS. Peter, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that is the way I've read it in the legislation. I believe that's the case. So it'll be the same process for all technologies.
Great. We have a question about speaker contact info. I may just have our presenters, if you want to drop your email address here in the chat for everyone to see. We can just do it that way, and then feel free to reach out to any of our presenters if you have any questions. I just put mine in there. If we could have presenters do that as well, that would be helpful. Let's see. And then the next question here, have probably Peter or Heather answer this one. It says, how does your community engagement strategy slash messaging change for hybrid projects where the battery storage or where the BESS is linked to another energy project versus standalone BESS projects?
Good question, Nick Alexander. So it's a question about timing and sort of the impact of it. We've seen projects where if it's going to be a 1,200-acre solar field with 10 acres of BESS sort of in the middle of that arrangement. We lead with sort of the solar acceptance and the solar impacts, and then build in the BESS later. Obviously, you don't want to be hiding things. So, the way you message it and the way you roll that out is important. Some folks are looking at like a hybrid interconnect where they have the option to include BESS, so they want to, keep that open, but they're thinking, primarily solar. So if the guess is that this is going to be primarily a solar project, maybe adding storage later. We start with the solar, but then not hiding the fact that there's potential for batteries. Um, in and so when you've got sort of a geographic separation between neighbors and the batteries, there tends to be a little bit less of a concern. Storage is great because you can site it close to load in the places where it's needed. So there are times when putting a battery project, close to a community or residences makes sense for the grid. You can't always put them in the middle of nowhere. That doesn't always make sense. So, but within a utility scale solar project, sometimes the BESS is, separated a ways from it. So, that's it's sort of a matter of, how you roll things out and how you introduce it to folks, and how you can answer questions. So I think throwing too much at folks at once can be a challenge, but you definitely want to, be transparent and share that information in a way that strategically works.
Great. Next question here, I'll have Deb answer this one. It says, what benefits do enterprise zones and high impact business designations have on property tax abatements in Illinois?
Yeah, so a lot of the benefits you'll see are indirect. For high impact business, it's mainly state level incentives, investment tax credits, certain, as I mentioned in the slide, um, sales tax exemptions, especially for big investment or job projects. So it's not an automatic property tax abatement program. Any property tax break would still be local or negotiated, but that is something to think about in the overall big picture of the project. And for enterprise zones, they can enable local property tax abatements on the increase in assessed value from any new construction. Land and existing value is still taxed. So that's not a full property tax exemption, but it does help. And that is something that's optional, of course, and approved by the specific taxing jurisdiction.
Great. Well, I think that about covers it. So thank you all for attending and your engagement. Appreciate the questions and conversation here. Um, as we mentioned earlier, this session is being recorded. We will send the recording out to all registrants. So look forward to seeing that in your email inboxes. Our next webinar is going to be sometime in March. We still are nailing down a time and a date, but we hope to see you all there. We'll be sending some information out about that once we have those details. So thank you to all of our presenters as well for your time and appreciate your expertise.
Thanks. Ethan, I want to just jump in. I was corrected by somebody through the chat there that the effective date for Surja is listed as June 1st, not July 1st. So that's probably the right date for it.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for correcting the record there. So June 1st. All right. Appreciate everyone hopping on here. Have a good rest of your Thursday.
Thank you,
Bye, all.
everyone.
Yeah.